Good afternoon. All right, agreed. Okay. Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome, and thank you very much for uh, coming on board for this session. And we are really delighted to have you all here, and we hope to hear from you soon. So without taking more time, I just want to introduce introduce the Ryerson Center for Immigration and Settlement. I am a professor at Ryerson and now the director of the Ryerson Center for Immigration and Settlement. Before this, I used to be the interim vice president for research and dean of the Faculty of Community Services for 10 years. And I came to Ryerson from University of Toronto. Before we start, I want to do the land acknowledgement. We want to acknowledge that RCIS, which is the acronym for the Ryerson Center for Immigration and Settlement, operates in downtown Toronto, which is a territory covered by the Dish with One Spoon Treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and the Haudenosaunee, as well as the Treaty 13 signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit and the Williams Treaty signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. This particular project is a grant from SHRC. The title of it is Refugee Resettlement and Integration in Canada, Lived Experience, Lessons Learned, and Promising Practices. This is a digital series. It was meant to be a, face-to-face conference kind of thing, but of course, due to this pandemic situation, we have made it into a digital one. This is going to focus on Canada's approach to refugee resettlement and integration. The series is funded, as I said, by Social Science and Humanities Research Council. The overall aim of the series is to engage stakeholders to consider Canada's approach to refugee resettlement and identify changes to policy and practice that will make Canada more inclusive and responsive to refugees' needs. Through this series, we aim to bring together refugees from the past and more recent cohorts, as well as settlement workers with service providers, policymakers, researchers, and students to share insights and lessons learned from research findings, settlement practice, and lived experience. So, as I said, this was originally planned as a two-day conference, but however, due to COVID-19, we have moved it into a webinar format. This will hopefully allow us to cover more topics over expanded course of 6 sessions. So we have completed 3 sessions. This is the 4th one, right, Sad?
Yes, this is the 4th.
And Sad and Suhail have been working hard at this series, and I want to thank them for their work. And we had a number of presenters, and it had been a very great learning experience for us. And we plan to kind of, write up all of this and put it on our website of the RCIS. So over to Sad for continuing the session. And I also have to apologize. I have to leave for another meeting at 3 o'clock, which is kind of fixed very long time ago. So I need to get out. Otherwise, I'll be here.
Thank you, Dr. Usha. I want to welcome everyone to this session. And today's session will be about the role of research and NGO expertise in the process of resettlement of refugees in Canada. And for this session, we have invited 3 wonderful guest speakers. We have Rania Younes, who is a co-founder and director of Welcome Home TO. We have Shireen Salti, who is the executive director of the Canadian Arab Institute. And we have Dr. John Carlaw, who is a research fellow at the Canadian Excellence Research Chair, CERC, in Migration and Integration at Ryerson University. I would like to give the opportunity to our guest speakers to briefly introduce themselves, and then we can start our discussion panel. Thank you. So I will leave it to whoever would like to introduce themselves first. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. My name is Shireen Salti. I'm the Executive Director of the Canadian Arab Institute.
Hello, everyone. My name is Rania, and I am one of the co-founders of Welcome Home TO. We're a not-for-profit network of very, very engaged citizens who envision a dynamic settlement network where all newcomers are welcomed with open hearts and minds and supported to reach their highest potential for a stronger Canada.
Right. Rania, can you raise your volume a little bit? Yeah, okay. All right, thank you. Is the Canadian Arab Institute a settlement agency or a research place?
It's a charity organization. Sorry, I should have introduced. It's a national, nonpartisan organization focused on the interests and issues of the Canadian Arab community through research and policy.
Okay. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. My name is John Carlaw, and as Saad said, I'm a postdoc with the CERC in Migration and Integration in here at Ryerson, and perhaps most relevantly, for a few years, I led the Syria Response and Refugee Initiative project as the project lead at York Center for Refugee Studies, which was also in partnership with Ryerson's Lifeline Syria Challenge, which I'm sure we'll talk a little more about. It's great to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you, Rania. Thank you, Shireen and John, for this introduction. And now I would like to start our panel discussion with an opening question. My opening question will be, what motivated you to be engaged in such a cause? And if I can have Rania, and then Shireen, and then John. Thank you.
Thanks, Saad. I mean, I guess everyone who's here today with us has been engaged at some level. For me, it started actually very personal. In 2015, everyone was moved by the pictures of Alayadik Kordi on the seashores. And for me in particular, he was very much at the same age as my son. So it was harder for me. I put myself in his mother's shoes, and I've been engaged ever since. I guess the refugee cause in particular is just also one of those causes where once you learn about it once, or once you start getting engaged, you know that you're going to be committed and engaged for forever, really, because it's a cause or a problem that's not going anywhere soon. So that's kind of how it started with me. At that time, Canada was welcoming Syrian refugees. That time I was actually working for the Canadian Arab Institute, and we had just submitted a policy brief and did a policy briefing with the immigration minister at that time. And they shortly after they approved, or they promised 10,000 refugees and 3,000, so 10,000 from Syria, 3,000 from Iraq. But then here we are 5 years later with over 70 plus Syrian refugees welcomed to Canada. When I first got involved, I thought, yes, I'm an Arab speaker myself. I'm not Syrian, but I'm Arab speaker. And I can do something. Maybe there's something for me to do to help welcome people. And I got engaged with a community of a community of volunteers that wanted to help. And that's how I came about my 4 other co-founders for Welcome Home TO. One of them was a refugee herself. The other person was just like me, very much committed to communicating the cause. And the 4th person was a private sponsor. He was actually in the process of privately sponsoring a family. And we took the cause to so many non-traditional places, like, for example, Civic Tech TO and all that, and really tried to take it to the civil level of how we can inspire innovation within settlement, but involve civil society. Until today, this is very much the focus of Welcome Home TO. How can how can you engage and bring to the table those who are not typically engaged in the settlement of refugees and newcomers in general? So that's kind of my little story. Yeah.
Okay.
Hi,
And
everyone. Saad, did you have a few questions for Rania, or did you want me to go?
no, so I just wanted to ask you to share. Thanks.
Sure. Thank you for allowing me to share. Well, that's a fantastic opening question. I am a newcomer myself, Saad. I am a Palestinian refugee with no right of return to my homeland, Jerusalem, and a Canadian immigrant. I watched my people seek refuge and become displaced, stateless over the last 70 decades. Palestinian refugees have it the worst because they're not recognized under the United Nations Third Country Agreement as refugees. But that's a big story that will require a summit of its own one day. I realized the importance of building social capital when that trauma led me to that theoretical work. I have a successful integration story because of the bonding and bridging social capital I built. I studied the concept of integration and what it means for privately sponsored and government assisted Syrian refugees a year following arrival in my Master's of Public Policy Administration and Law at York University. So my research contribution were, my questions were, what are the most useful services and programs offered to Syrian refugees during their first year of arrival? In particular, how have these services differed in the way that they offer support to government-assisted refugees versus privately sponsored refugees? I also volunteered with newcomer community organizations in the past 10 years. Both Rania and John have led some of these organizations like YU Refugees, Lifeline Syria, the Canadian Arab Institute, and the Together Project. So this is all full circle for me, and I'm very excited to be here. So in summary, a combination of lived experience, theoretical and practical knowledge on newcomer integration really is what allowed me to lead the Canadian Arab Institute in my mid-20s. And that's why the vision for the Institute is centered around integration as a whole, whether it's identity, whether it's health, employment, education, or civic engagement. The Arab community in Canada is the largest newcomer population across the country and also the fastest growing immigrant population since 2006. So I'm really excited to be here and learn more about your integration stories. I believe we're all carrying impactful stories. What differentiates us from others is our ability to advocate for the integration of others in Canada.
Thank you, Shireen. Yes, we definitely hold those, beliefs and causes that we can change many things. And with such engagements and exchange of knowledge, for sure, we will one day have our goals attained. Thank you. And now I will give it to John.
Thank you. I think like Ronnie and Shireen, there are probably a lot of things one could say. I think the ones I would probably highlight as an undergraduate student, I got engaged with the World University Service of Canada local committee when I was at Wilfrid Laurier. And I actually joined that because I had actually seen a failed referendum when they were trying to sponsor more refugee students and was kind of so appalled. I felt I needed to get involved with that committee. And that led me to have experience with resettling refugee students who come through that program. And I think that was a very seminal experience. And then years later, I had done the Center for Refugee Studies summer course at York University, and they had introduced me to FCJ Refugee Center here in Toronto. And I think having done some kind of visible fundraising with them and working on a dissertation topic on immigration, I ended up being recruited around the time of interest of sponsoring Syrian refugees that Rania described. And so it was a really wonderful opportunity to work on a resettlement project and also bring to it an interest in engaging with students and the community to raise awareness around refugee issues and get engaged in advocacy and education efforts as well. So I think those are kind of some of the gateways into that work.
Thank you, John, for this wonderful explanation. So now I will move into the questions that will be directed to each of the guest speakers. And I will start with Rania Younes and Shireen Salti. And my first question to them is, can you determine the involvement of settlement agencies and NGOs in Canada's refugee sponsorship and resettlement process? Was it a spontaneous or pre-structured participatory model? Thank you.
Rania, I'll let you go first.
Okay, but you're going to go first the next time. Okay, first I just want to clarify, Sad, for everyone as well. When we say NGOs, like non-governmental organizations, let's be clear that some of them are mandated to do settlement work, some of them are not. Some services are direct services, some services are indirect services. So they will vary very much in structure, right? There is a structured there is a structure to settlement services in Canada for not-for-profits, whether they are funded by the government directly or indirectly. But when it came to, in particular, the last wave of welcoming Syrian refugees that started in 2016, many things that happened were very much spontaneous. They were not structured. And I think that we've been witnessing a lot in the last couple of weeks, a lot of talks and celebrations of how 5 years have passed since that time. And you would be able just to tell, if you've attended a couple of those, how much this was very much a national project that everyone took part in. Whether you got directly involved with it or not, you were connected to it. You knew that it was happening. You knew that so many things were working out there to make this happen. So it was part spontaneous, part pre-structured. And I think that as much as it came with challenges, it is a great example of how when everyone comes together, lots of good things can actually happen. I think it's a great example. There's a lot of great examples. As much as there were barriers and challenges and lots of work still to do, there are great examples out there of how this sentiment that took on Canada in 2016, welcoming Syrian refugees, needs to be something we practice every day with newcomers, with all refugees. And I think I was just telling Shireen a day ago or something, if people remember that refugees come in every day, they didn't just come in 2016 and disappear. They still come in. They come in every day, and they will continue to. And so if we all have somewhere in our hearts and minds a piece out there to know that there's a role for us to play in welcoming newcomers in Canada every day, Canada can be very different. Yeah, so I'll just stop here for the moment. Shireen, all yours.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it was both. I don't think it's one or the other. I don't think it was 100% spontaneous or 100%, a pre-structured participatory model. I think those existing structures allowed for, such a galvanizing response from all sectors. I think seeing that spontaneous kind of movement, resembled the Canadian kind of generosity on an individual level, not just on a collective level. People who were really interested in helping out after they were moved by that picture. But we've seen how that heightened public awareness of a particular refugee movement and the heightened awareness of the pre-migration challenges of that movement was necessary to ensure a positive integration trajectory on the part of the host society. And that was done through educational sessions, exhibitions, workshops, collaborative projects across all levels of government, as well as the support for local and center initiatives that focus on the integration of refugees. But I do want to highlight, because it is just for research purposes, that Syrian refugee resettlement response was a stark contrast to past efforts and responses. We already know this, that Canada's combined intake of refugees across all categories and source countries exceeded 30,000 for the first time since 2006, surpassed 40,000 for the first time since 1992, and that marked the fifth such occasion since 1979, according to our board member, Karim Al-Assal. So the response was at all levels of government. You know, seeing that Ontario government created a Syrian refugee resettlement kind of secretariat on its own and worked closely in collaboration with all governments to ensure that seamless, coordinated, and appropriate support for refugees who arrived in Ontario was also very, very unique. And of course, in addition to the government's overwhelming response, private sponsorship played a huge role in the Syrian Refugee Response Initiative. Twice as many GARs were resettled through the private sponsorship program. You know, by not-for-profit organizations like Lifeline Syria, and many faith groups applied through churches, mosques, or synagogues. You know, it still baffles me to see that Canada is the only country in the world to offer both private and government sponsorship programs. I was at the Arab American Institute, or counterpart in Washington, D.C. I was giving a conference there. There was a conference there on refugee resettlement and the challenges they're seeing with Arab American refugees. And, you know, I got up and I asked, you know, where's your private sponsorship model? Why are you not learning from Canadians on the importance of integration? It's a key, it's an essential program, and we're very lucky to have it. And that's not possible, like Rania said, without the support of many Canadians that play a role in this. I think Australia adopted that model in 2013, and there is a global kind of agenda to push for more things forward, but we have yet to see, you know, both that question is so good, is like both that pre-structured participatory model as well as that spontaneous kind of generosity and that galvanizing response. So in summary, I would say both.
Thank you, Shireen, and thank you, Rania, for these wonderful answers and insights. And now I will turn into John, and I will ask him a specific question in parallel to what I asked Rania and Shireen. So the first question for John is, can you emphasize the university's role as an institution in Canada's refugee sponsorship and resettlement process? How would you describe its advocacy in civil society around refugee issues?
Sure. Thank you, Saad. Well, I have a bunch of positive things to say about a few initiatives to answer this question. But I have to say, if I'm honest, you know, if you think about the big picture globally, more than 79.5 million people displaced, according to the UNHCR in its 2019 data, that honestly Canada and its universities could and should do more, even much more. That being said, well, I would just say the universities are really an underutilized resource in this respect. If you consider the global need, the size of the university sector in Canada, I was looking at the Universities Canada website just to get a sense of resources, and they describe in the billions of dollars the size of the sector. So I think this is important context. And as well, that being engaged in refugee resettlement, as we've seen in some efforts, is a tremendous learning opportunity for students, both in their cross-cultural capacities, being engaged in that work, learning about other parts of the world, learning about the Canadian political system, global development. So in many ways, being engaged in these types of things is a win-win. Now, that being said, some of our universities have made and are making some really great contributions. Perhaps in recent years, most notably is the Ryerson University Lifeline Syria Challenge, which really, it arose from the Syrian refugee crisis and advocacy, especially by Lifeline Syria, a civil society organization, kind of in the GTA. And this was a really great example of collaborations between civil society and amongst universities, because Ryerson also reached out to U of T, York, and OCAD University. And in around over the course of around 4 years, generated almost 100 refugee sponsorship groups and sponsored well over 400 refugees, mostly Syrian refugees, which was an amazing effort. And it came about in large part due to leadership at high levels of the university, which perhaps most prominently Wendy Suke, the former vice president of Ryerson in the upper reaches of the administration, but who also partnered with students and donors and community members to really drive this initiative. So I would just say with that, there's also a need for universities to invest in staff to support these efforts. And Ryerson also did some very innovative things, such as supporting a charitable donation infrastructure, which is something that sponsor groups really need. So I would highlight that initiative. I would also highlight in Canada the importance of the work of the World University Service of Canada, which is probably currently the most sustainable university initiative that exists. It's more than 40 years old, and currently it sponsors across 95 Canadian campuses. They sponsor about 130 refugee students per year. To be honest, that number feels low to me, given how many universities we have. But that's not WUSC's fault. WUSC responds to what campuses are willing to do. And they actually educate committees all the time on how to run a referendum, to, for example, support sponsorship through student levies. So that's another initiative I would highlight. But the variance between universities, some campuses would sponsor, I think the most is 8 refugee students a year, others do 1. So there's a variation. And the last initiative maybe I'd mention that's another demonstration of some great work universities are doing is at Wilfrid Laurier University, in an organization that actually arose out of a classroom project, which is called International Students Overcoming War. And they resettle refugees using the student visa path. As many of you will know, it takes a long time to bring refugees from overseas, but using the student visa path to support what they refer to as ISO scholars actually brings people here much more quickly. So I'd say some universities are doing amazing, inspiring work, but I think in the global context, we need to do more, and we need to devote the resources to doing and supporting them.
Thank you, John, for these wonderful answers. And for sure, as you said, a lot can be done, but it's good to know that there are some initiatives that are already in place, and that people in universities are motivated to take things into the next levels. And now I will pass into Rania and Shireen, and then I will ask you the second question. Can you describe the partnerships between NGOs and civil society around refugee issues?
I promise I'd go first the second time around. So, that's an interesting question. Of course, there has yet to be a legitimate framework for the partnerships between various sectors for refugee resettlement. And I think that's a continued resettlement struggle that does not allow for a true integration. For example, in my study, I examined how information was used by government-assisted refugees versus privately sponsored refugees in their first year of arrival, particularly how Syrian refugees use that information through the orientation session that they received prior to migration or during their first month of arrival. And this orientation session really is usually done either by NGOs or civil society or government, right? And so it's very interesting to see that there was no consistency between the information that various refugees received, even that same refugee cohort. This orientation session is supposed to provide information on Canadian culture, lifestyle, compliance, everyday information on the overall Canadian system and the supports that refugees need to rely on during their early integration period, which is crucial. And so, seeing that lack of information was an emerging theme, that most government-assisted refugees and PSRs mentioned that certain services by government and community organizations could have been improved, like those orientation sessions that were facilitated by NGOs and civil society. They were found to be insufficient, that they still lacked useful information for their early integration period. And these sentiments kind of reoccurred throughout my interviews. This is of course problematic, because these sessions are supposed to facilitate an understanding of the various integration supports that refugees need during their first months of resettlement. And it's important to note that respondents also received these orientation sessions at different times, different locations, and different countries, different providers prior to migration or after. So it's clear that we need to have access to consistent information, because that plays a key role in the integration of refugees, and that there needs to be a better structured framework for those partnerships between NGOs, civil society, and government, so that everyone's talking to each other about how they're communicating to racialized communities like refugees. And then that caveat is to consider those pre-migration challenges, to consider where that refugee cohort's coming from, what kind of information they need, how much information they need during the first months of arrival. But that's just one example of how complex that framework is, and how much more work we need to do to strengthen it by working together in various sectors.
Thank you, Shireen.
That's a very, again, it's a very interesting question. And just to build on what Shireen just said, I'm going to agree with what she had said, but I'm also going to tell you that it's not enough. There's not enough partnerships between NGOs and civil society, when really, and not just around refugee issues. I think given that we live in Canada, and immigration in general is very much a key component of how we thrive as a country, civil society and NGOs need to be much more involved together on that. Because at the end of the day, you're integrating people, you're integrating more Canadians, and there just needs to be much more involvement. Now, luckily, we do have a couple of pathways, just as John had mentioned earlier, that kind of make Canada a little bit different and special in terms of engaging civil society. We have the private sponsorship model, but then we also have the BVOR, the blended visa, which also gives a great opportunity. And I think if I'm not mistaken, it was almost launched just recently and trialed out. And I think it give a great opportunity. It is a great example, and it demonstrates how when you involve civil society with certain issues, you do get better results. Beyond the complexities Shireen mentioned, I think it's just always very important to remember that at the end of the day, refugees come here and they need friends. They need other people to relate to. They need people who care about their issues beyond the 9-to-5 position that a settlement counselor or a manager or some sort of an agency or a settlement agency can provide. And I think that the private sponsorship model and the BVOR model very much demonstrates how it is extremely important, and it's not enough. There's not enough efforts out there that encourage civil society and not-for-profits to get together on issues of social integration and for refugees and other newcomers as well. It's getting better, I have to say. It did get better over the last 5 years, but it's not structured, just as Shireen said. It's not structured, it's not legitimized. And it's got its own set of barriers, because serving immigrants and refugees in particular, because they're more of they have more, there's a word for it, I can't remember it right now, but they're more high needs, and therefore they're more vulnerable. They're a vulnerable client set. And so even when it comes to trying to force or forge or start collaborations between an NGO and civil society, there comes a set of rules that everyone has to abide to, and like there's lots of things that get in the way that complicate it, when at the end of the day it's really just about receiving new neighbors. And you know, I don't know why I need to get too many things to commit to and to sign just to go over to my neighbor and make sure that we're friends and I can invite them or whatnot. I mean, COVID aside, but that part needs a lot more work for sure. I hope that answered the question somehow.
Thank you, Rania. Yes, definitely that answered the question. And now I will turn into John, and I will ask a parallel question, but this time talking about university students. So how did some university students contribute to the engagement work around refugee matters in Canada?
Well, I mean, university students have contributed very tremendously to this work. I mean, I mentioned WUSC from across Canada. I think that I'll speak maybe to the examples I know a little kind of best between York and Ryerson from what I've seen. Shireen also has experience in this realm. She may want to add a few comments, but no pressure there at all. At York, so during about 4 years, we ran the Syria Response and Refugee Initiative. We collaborated with around 20 student organizations in that time. And I have to say, I was constantly inspired by these students' efforts. For example, several student organizations, even before our work had started, had founded Refugee Awareness Week, which was founded by students groups, Refuge Aid, Amnesty International at York and WUSC, for example, and we subsequently engaged in their activities. And they were regularly doing awareness raising activities and fundraising for refugees, both overseas and as well as those resettled to our community. At both Ryerson and York, students were members of every refugee sponsorship team. Of those 100 teams, there was at least a student member on each one. And students were actually often were leaders amongst those teams. They weren't just kind of along for the experience. In some cases, they were leading. One Ryerson student who kind of helped found the Ryerson Lifeline Syria Challenge, for example, Samantha Jackson, actually her and her partner used their wedding as a fundraiser and raised $60,000 or so for refugee sponsorship. So just some really incredible examples. Was Kiel, they did a transportation loan campaign. As some of you will be aware and others will be disgusted to know, Canada actually charges the refugees who are resettled for their transportation to come to Canada in the form of a loan, which creates a significant amount of hardship for many resettled refugees. So we tried to raise some awareness and fundraise to pay off some of the loans our students faced. Unfortunately, we were only able to do that for a few students, but it's an ongoing issue. But students tackled this very directly. Our students really benefited from partnerships and work with the Canadian Council for Refugees and Amnesty. We did some Refugees Welcome Here campaign, awareness raising and activities as part of a Canadian Council for Refugees campaign. We hosted a national newcomer and refugee youth conference. We did winter clothing drives with students, which they led for the FCJ Refugee Center. Pierre-Andre Theriault, who co-led the overall efforts at York for part of our work, he taught and led as a PhD student a course with the Refugee Sponsorship Support Program that actually helped a lot of sponsor groups through all of the paperwork and challenges that refugee sponsor groups faced, and he actually won a major university award for that. So, I mean, it's a bit of a list, but it's just to really give you a sense that students, when they have support from staff and doors open for their ideas. So really do make remarkable contributions.
Thank you, John. And for sure, students and also the civil society in general, they play a major role into these kind of interactions between institutions and I would say government authorities in order to address many issues. Among them is the refugee issues. Now we will pass into a kind of more complex question. And this question, we will try to find kind of, I would say, alternative approaches to the current like resettlement process. So my question to Rania and Shireen is, how have governmental policies impacted the non-profit sector's ability to advocate on behalf of refugees? Is there an alternative approach to improve refugee resettlement and enhance advocacy? Thank you.
Yeah, so those are two big questions. So I'll try to tackle the first one and maybe I'll move to the second one. So, how have, you said, government policies impacted the not-for-profit sector ability to advocate, right? So I think, in principle, refugee resettlement countries believe that refugees should participate in planning their own resettlement and social integration, and that role of the society and service providers is to facilitate the integration, right? But in the context of resettlement, remarkably little attention has been given to understanding the experiences and priorities from refugees' own perspectives. And this misconception kind of results from a tendency to view refugees as an issue for society rather than as the active individuals they often are. And so, of course, the first way to answer that question is that we should place a better and a greater emphasis on identifying refugees' needs and different experiences, like Rania mentioned, to enhance their integration experience. And that kind of will require kind of striving to include refugee perspectives to those of other stakeholders in the process at the initial point of arrival. And I say initial point of arrival because I've seen this like throughout literature, throughout, government kind of responses, but we often wait 10 years or 20 years to study how the Vietnamese did in 1979, how the Iraqis did in 2008. Oh, well, they came during a recession, that's why they're struggling, or they came. So why are we waiting 10 years to go back and see how a cohort did when we can just ask them? You can go and ask them how they're doing. And I think that's key, and people often forget. And of course, viewing refugees from where they come from and their pre-migration challenges. For example, Arab refugees experiencing a different kind of trauma than any other refugee because they don't have a background in democracy. They're now in a democracy and now they're told that they need to vote, that's an importance when there's other stuff on their minds and other kind of important issues that they haven't even addressed, like food on the table, etc. So ensuring that we understand refugees' challenges from their own perspective, and government policy playing a better emphasis to allow the not-for-profit sector to understand those needs, study them, and not so much rely on that not-for-profit sector to deliver public policy for refugees, right? Because we've seen how that can happen as well. The shift in power of who's in control of the resettlement experience of refugees. Is it how much government policy is at play in resettlement versus other sectors, and who's responsible for what, right? So again, very complex question and takes obviously multiple layers to answer it, but that's, I think, the summary that I'd like to leave you with are these questions of those responsibilities when it comes to advocacy, because who is responsible for the advocating of refugees if it's not themselves, right? When they know what they need the most out of everybody else. What is the alternative approach to improving and enhancing advocacy? I'll speak strictly from a research kind of point of view. I think what I've seen in my research is that there needs is a constant need for social capital support, building social capital. And by that, I mean that government assisted refugee is meeting the government employee during the first month of arrival and never seeing them ever again. And that privately sponsored refugee is building a connection and an amazing connection with a sponsor over the first year. And we've seen, and people have studied over many years, how that even goes beyond that first year of financial support. It becomes a phone call, how's it going and how can I help, beyond that first year of financial support. Whereas government assisted refugees continue to lack, friends, like Rania said, social capital, but not just friends, access to information, and information that is immensely useful to navigating that Canadian system. And I've seen this in my volunteer experience with the Together project, whereby that welcome group model's emphasis is to ensure that Canadians are matched with refugees through a cultural ambassador that speaks both Arabic and English, to really transfer knowledge about the Canadian system, whether it's health, employment, or language, etc., and how that family feels, that family's trust in institutions is increasing, that family's social belonging and safety, and all those really important things that are not studied, like their sense of safety in Canada is really important. We've seen how when you match them with Canadian citizens, or when you match government-assisted refugees with opportunities to increase their social capital, they do better. So I think when it comes to advocacy, government programs and community organizations need to constantly ensure that actors, whether it's volunteer hosts, sponsors, language instructors, orientation providers, interpreters, are all finding the optimal way. And this is, of course, visionary, but the optimal way to sustain trust and empathy in order to nourish the building of social inclusion for refugees in that whole society, and ensuring that these actors at points of entry are all facilitating an inclusive environment to promote an integration trajectory for both groups. And students, in my lived experience, I've also seen students who have the lived experience, like myself, an Arab Canadian who wants to contribute, who can and is able, because I understand my people's culture more than anyone else, is key. And it's crucial for universities to play a role in this, to allow various Shireens in university classrooms to contribute in that refugee resettlement, and facilitate orientation sessions and language training classes, and provide interpretation services to refugees to, create a better potential increase to social inclusion for refugees. Because at the end of the day, refugees come from various cultures, and we need to ensure that we're meeting the cultural needs of refugees. So with Arab refugees, I can't tell you the smiles on their faces when I, go in with Canadians and speaking the English language, but then turning Arab on them and providing that cultural Arab generosity and kind of support from my own kind of lived experience, and ensuring them that they are safe, that they belong, and that we can work together to ensure that we meet their needs. And nothing beats that social capital bond and that bridging between that whole society. For me, that's what true integration means, and that's what we need to, continue to work for, to ensure that their advocacy needs are met.
Thank you so much, Shireen, for this insightful contribution. And now we have Rania.
I'm kind of debating how honest I need to be here.
Be honest.
Okay, just when we come to say advocacy, again, I'd just like us to be clear on the fact that when we say advocacy, there's a difference between social advocacy and actual advocacy work, because not-for-profits and charities in particular, which most of them are if they're receiving funding, there's a limit to how much advocacy they can do, okay? So it's not the mandate of those not-for-profits to actually do advocacy on part of refugees. The governmental, the system of welcoming and settling refugees is is currently a bit challenged with the fact that the way it's structured and the way they receive funding, they're competing with each other. Okay, and so they don't really put just as Shireen said, they don't put the user experience, that experience of the refugee, at the heart of everything they do. They put the funding model heart at the heart of it, right? And it's not because they're bad. I'm not criticizing what they're doing, or it's just because that's how things have worked and are working, or how they're funded, or how they need to report back, or whatnot. And we found this at Welcome Home TO because during the welcoming of refugees, Syrian refugees in particular, in 2016, many of the private sponsor groups that we worked with looked around and said, we know the services exist, we know the resources exist, but...
Can I ask a quick question, Saad?
Yes, sure,
Sure.
Professor.
Okay, to Rania and Shireen. I have a project now funded by SHIRK, which is a project partnership development grant, looking at the settlement experiences of Syrian refugees. So we have finished collecting data. We are in the process of analyzing it. What comes to us as the biggest challenge for them is just like the settlement of the economic immigrants, is inability to get employment. And unlike the economic immigrants, many of them talk about the fact that they do not know enough of English to actually feel safe to look for work and to look for accreditation and stuff like that. In your work, have you come across this language training as a biggest, language acquisition as a biggest, as one of the biggest challenges they have, or is that just this group, or this sample that I have?
Yeah, actually, you know what? That really kind of passes on really well to the point where I stopped. Yes, there has been a huge challenge, but the challenge really comes from the fact that no one has asked Syrian refugees or has looked into how they are able to receive that information, versus putting them into link classes that were developed for economic immigrants.
Right,
they weren't developed for, right? So, we've done various focus groups, and we've done various mapping, whether it's service mapping, whether it's experience mapping, projects at Welcome Home TO, and many refugees will tell you, the link classes were not even prepared for those that are, many of the government-sponsored refugees were illiterate in their own language, okay? And link is starting at a level where you're literate in a certain language, and I'm giving you English as a second language. And how do you engage a person in language if they are illiterate in their own language, right?
Yeah.
But then when we also say illiterate, let me just kind of plug in this story. I've met a family in a hotel where the wife said, me and my husband didn't go to school. We have 6 children. I'm taking care of my father-in-law, this, and that. And I'm like, oh my God, they're going to be totally lost. Let me see if I can help and all. And here I am giving them my business card so that they can call me. And the man just takes the card and he says, oh, your name is Rania? I'm like, yeah, do you read? I thought you didn't go to school. He's like, no, I didn't go to school, but I'm a businessman back in Syria. So I have to know how to read, write, and do basic. So sometimes also when someone says illiterate, we always take it into mind like, oh, they know nothing. No, they know something, right? They've thrived back home at some level, and we did not take that into consideration. And that's where it goes back to the point where no one asks Syrian refugees, or no one asks refugees or newcomers in general, not just the Syrians, what do you know? And then they add to it. We just always take them and we assume that they don't know this, they don't know that, and we decide to dump things on them. And we never ask ourselves, are the things that are dumped on them needed or not, right? I've sat with refugees in focus groups who would tell you, I sit in the link class, I go just because I need to sign that I'm there, because that's how I get my, whatever it is that I'm participating, right? But I have never found them useful, except that one day our instructor told us how to use an ATM machine. Ta-da! Right? So
right.
I don't know. These programs don't ask themselves sometimes, what is it that I'm actually doing that's important or not? And so we forget that. And so going back a bit to answering your questions too, Sad, those types of funding policies or processes and whatnot sometimes become a huge barrier because they don't leave space for us, just like Shireen said, to ask the refugees, what do you need? We just assume this is what they need. She also talked about trauma, and the thing is, we stigmatize trauma. Trauma is very real, and it happens on not just a refugee. Any migrant has immigration trauma in general, right? But we always think of the word trauma very negatively, and so we decide we need to fix those people. They don't need fixing. They need to be engaged. They need to be involved. They need to participate right away. And you need to provide and facilitate those opportunities to get them participating, because that's how you're going to build the belonging, and that's how you're going to build their contributions. They're ready to contribute, right? But we also need to give space for understanding immigrants that, refugees in particular, is that while immigrants choose to come to Canada, refugees didn't choose anything. They didn't even choose leaving their own homes.
Right. Yeah.
Let alone picking Canada for them. The UNHCR just went, here you go, you're going to Canada, that's it, right? They decide that for them as well. So that part needs to be a little bit considered. And just to close off with your last part of an alternative approach, I would say the alternative approach is we need more civil society engaged. That's how advocacy is going to be better. And we saw it through private sponsorship groups. We saw it through BVOR groups. When civil society became part of the journey of the refugees and newcomers, they realized how difficult it was. And this is when they were willing and ready to kind of say, we need to do this differently. Right? That's where social enterprises started coming into place. That's when businesses, that's when RBC started doing things like the Arrive program and this and that. Where did that come from? Where did all those amazing students, right, start all those great initiatives? They started because they were part of groups that were helping refugees, and they realized, oh wow, that's difficult. That's a difficult journey. I now know what it feels like, and so I'm going to be part of it, right? So the more you start making civil society part of that journey, that settlement journey, the more it's going. That's the best way to go, because only you who are going into this journey will know how to address it. So, and that's very much what we encourage in Welcome Home TO, and that's what we did when we started seeing all those initiatives coming up. We brought civil society and not-for-profits together in rooms with government, and we said, okay, let's hack something. Let's find solutions where we can all put our heads together and find a better way to do language. And that's what we did. We did disruptor labs, and we came up with amazing collaborations between civil or private initiatives and not-for-profits that started doing English in a different way, with on-the-spot language, for example. They were an initiative that came through that way. They would just take refugees and take them to the street and start learning right at the street. That's how you started getting those initiatives of teaching English while you're working. So employment, teaching language while like on the job, right? That's how all these initiatives started, because civil society was very much part of the process.
Okay, I'm so sorry I need to leave, but I hate to leave this session because it's really interesting. I would have loved to stay, but anyway, hopefully I'll listen to the recording. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Usha.
And I'll be watching later.
Yes.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you so much, Rania, for this wonderful explanation. And I agree with you that the role of civil society and refugees themselves is important in order to improve things and improve settlement and integration in general. We need to listen to what people have to say. We need to know their concerns and so on. So thank you for that. So now I will go into John, and I will ask you this question based on some of your work. Can you identify the policy differences between Canadian governments over time, current liberals versus formal conservatives in handling refugee resettlement? And can you elaborate more on the settlement levels and the practice of additionality? Thank you.
Sure, Saad. Maybe to start, it's maybe worth mentioning or explaining the concept of additionality. So basically, since the origins of refugee sponsorship in Canada now several decades ago, an important principle has been that of additionality, where the refugee sponsorship taken on by private citizens and members of society is to be additional and not replace the efforts of government. Because obviously, why would people want to engage in private sponsorship if they feel they're just doing something that the government, like if they're not additionally adding to the pool of refugee sponsored, it really reduces the motivations. So this is a principle really that both governments of both persuasions in recent years in particular have really been shifting towards the private rather than the government direction. So which I'll explore a little bit more. Another important policy I think that both governments of conservative and liberal persuasion have shared have been caps and limitations on private refugee sponsorship. So for example, in Canadian society, we don't allow private groups to basically sponsor as many refugees as they demonstrate the capacity to resettle. Since 2011, under the Conservatives, caps were implemented for the first time, and so civil society is limited, and the Liberals lifted those caps just for Syrians for a very short period of time, kind of 2015 and early 2016, but those were put back. So that's another policy that they share. And also both governments in recent years have required groups of 5 in particular to only be able to sponsor refugees who with a UNHCR status certificate or some other formal government recognition, which in many parts of the world you just cannot get. So there are a lot of obstacles to the resettlement of refugees that arguably don't make a lot of sense for a society that wants to support refugee resettlement. Maybe to compare and think a little bit about levels, the Conservative government in office from 2006 to 2015 definitely admitted less refugees, both government assisted or privately sponsored, than the current Liberal government. Although their numbers were not as low as they weren't as big a departure compared to prior governments than some people might actually assume. So under the Liberals, we've seen increases in both government-assisted refugees and privately sponsored refugees. So under the Conservatives, their peak year in our office peak year that they were the government for the entire year was around 7,600 government-assisted refugees. And their peak for privately sponsored refugees was about 6,400. So these are pretty low numbers. And so under the Liberals, if we remember their 2015 election promise to resettle 25,000 Syrian refugees, it was a major departure for that number. It jumped actually government-assisted refugees to over 23,000 in 2016. But that number dipped very quickly the next year back down to just under 9,000. So the change is perhaps not as much as you would think. If you just think about typical years, and the Liberals are promising next year to bring in about 12,500, I believe, in refugees, and to allow private sponsors in 2021 to resettle 22,500. So if you were to say the percentage increase, that really does seem like a big number. But if you think about the capacity of the entire federal government and Canadian civil society, looking at a conservative government number of 6,400 versus 12,500, it's not as big as you might think. And we're seeing that civil society is doing much more of the labor than the government is. If you look at 22,500, it's almost double what the government's doing. Maybe the last remark I would make on this is that both conservative and liberal governments have kind of boasted about Canada's generosity, seeing the disaster of what Trump had done in the United States. We're now the world leader in resettlement, which it's nice to be comparatively number one, but we need to remember the Canadian people, not the government, actually are behind much of that effort. But also, both while kind of boasting of Canadian generosity in terms of resettlement, have imposed very restrictive measures when it comes to accessing the Canadian refugee determination system by refugee claimants. And recent papers by some Ryerson colleagues, Agdil Tak, Zainab Abu Arab, and Claire Ellis, actually just have a fresh paper this month on recent restrictions to making refugee claims that have come in. So most of you will know, we can voluntarily resettle refugees from overseas, but we have international law commitments to the way that we treat refugee claimants who come to Canada. So while so both of those governments are really not living up to our responsibilities for refugee claimants, and we shouldn't lose that in this discussion.
Thank you, John, for these wonderful and insightful contributions. And now, before we close our first part of the session, I would like to ask a question for all the guests. And this question is, what were the barriers encountered while being involved in the refugee resettlement process?
There's so many. I feel like this is all me and Rania talk about, is just like the amount of barriers that so many newcomers face. And there's so many stories. And I'd hate to, summarize it all in 5 minutes, but perhaps just out of respect, I'd like to give the platform to Rania to really cover her notion of barriers from her own perspective first.
That was very sneaky of you. Again, I don't think there's enough to speak about in such a short while, but I'm going to go back again to, at least with Welcome Home TO, with the team, what we found initially when we started bringing people together. One of the main barriers we encountered was this whole, there was lack of communication, lack of access to information. I think the lack of accessibility is a huge barrier for many that, whether they're trying to settle themselves or they're trying to help someone resettle, there's lack of accessibility to information, to resources, and to just getting access to what's available out there. You would hear one day, oh, this is available, and then you would hear it. John mentioned something earlier that's very important. Everyone would read the news and they would say, oh, the government is giving refugees too much money. But in reality, no one knew about the travel loans. No one knows about all the difficulties that groups that were trying to help refugees and refugees themselves, the challenges and the pressures they have to deal with right off the bat, trying to know that on their first day of coming to Canada, there was a loan that they had to cover already, right? When they came with nothing. That in itself was huge. There were definitely language barriers, there's definitely cultural barriers, and there's this whole point too of the fact that they are categorized as vulnerable populations. it gives less accessibility for people to help them. I mean, initially, when we tried to bring so many service providers to the table as Welcome Home TO, many of them refused to, at the beginning, they refused to participate because there should not be access to everyone, to those with vulnerable backgrounds. They took care of it right after that, and we found ways to get around it. And they were very proactive, and later on, lots of settlement agencies opened the doors for many volunteers and many collaborations. But initially, that was a huge barrier as well, which made a lot of new refugees feel very isolated. So if any of the people here on the call remember how many were in hotels for number of months, many of them felt isolated and no access, like no one was allowed to go and visit them or see them until agencies were able to organize themselves, and that made them very much scared and very isolated. So yeah, these are just the ones that come to mind initially, because I remember at that time we found a lot of. But in terms of the full resettlement process, gosh, that's I'm sure you have a lot to uncover from the series that you had, but that's a very long discussion.
Thanks, Rania. That's excellent. I think to add just something that's unique to what Rania's saying and what we've all said before, you know, I spoke a lot about the importance of social capital and, you know, the lack of bridging and wanting social capital as barriers to resettlement, because I truly view integration from the framework of social capital. But, you know, my latest research study with Toronto Foundation and the Together project with Dr. Heine from York, it'll be out next year. I can't give too much details on the findings and results, but I'll give you a unique analysis of the latest barriers and challenges that are facing newcomers in Toronto right now, specifically Arab newcomers. What we're finding is, you know, that specifically with the context of the pandemic and COVID. So, you know, having access to a group of 5 Canadians provided so much mental health support for newcomers because they were isolated and had zero access to anybody to talk to in Canada to understand what they should be doing next, where to apply for funding, to get help, etc. So that in and of itself, just access to people to talk to, we found that increased, you know, so much of their mental health support. We know that language learning is of course a barrier, employment's a barrier, access to healthcare is a barrier, you know, social isolation and child education. These are all challenges that, you know, all newcomers face. But imagine in the context of a newcomer who has, you know, we asked in that survey, how many people do you know in Canada, or how many people do you live with, how many people are you related to? Again, very little people that they know that can help them to integrate and resettle, and which you know, thereby means very little access to information and people that they can depend on for support. And so we really, I really want to highlight the importance of people coming together from across Canada, whether it's, you know, the government, you know, putting more funding into civil society to have access to mentorship programming or matching of refugees, to allow for at least that access to sense of belonging to local community. And that difference of what people working together can make, we found it was an extremely big difference. We asked the government-assisted refugees, when they think about problems in their own community, how much of a difference do you believe people working together as a group can make in solving problems that you can see? So we asked very interesting questions, and we really understood that newcomers come from, no one really talks about this as much in the literature, but newcomers come from a sense of community that is unlike any other sense of community in the world, right? And when you ask them about their sense of belonging in Canada, they're often like, well, I can't even, you know, I don't even know my neighbor's name. And that's strange to me, you know? So the idea that these newcomers don't even know their neighbor's name in and of itself is social isolation. So we need as many, you know, in and of itself is a barrier that is not highlighted as much, and that plays a huge role in the mental health kind of stability of a newcomer in Canada. And as a newcomer myself, this was a huge challenge, that lack of community support and engagement. So I reiterate and emphasize what Rania said, and continue to advocate for the need of community support for newcomers in a pandemic specifically, now more than ever, is crucial.
Thank you, Shireen.
So I'm going to mention two things. I'll try and keep it brief. These are more actually from the side of things of refugee sponsors, and trying to work with refugee sponsors, which obviously will impact the treatment that resettled refugees received. A huge challenge in our work were processing times and shifting policies around refugee resettlement. You know, when the Liberal government declared refugee resettlement a kind of a national project and really accelerated the resettlement of Syrian refugees at first, this was very positive for sponsors in that they could bring a group together and they knew refugees were going to arrive and they could plan for them. Once these processing times nearly overnight went from very quick to, you know, a year or more, sometimes multiple years, this was a tremendous challenge because, you know, you have to think about, if you're a refugee sponsorship group, at least 5 people, you come together for this common project, but then it takes years for someone to arrive. Of course, this is a tremendous challenge to group cohesion. You know, people's lives shift. Some people leave the country, or in the university sector, they go to do research, or if it's students, they graduate. And I know this affects sponsor groups beyond the university context. So with these long wait times, by the time refugees come, the cohesiveness of the groups that are to welcome and support them are not necessarily what they should be. So I think this points out to, again, how important it is to have the governments promptly process sponsorship applications and conduct interviews and bring people here. Like, the change was literally so fast that Ryerson colleagues who were involved in matching sponsor groups to refugees to be resettled literally stayed up all night before the deadline kicked in to sponsor some refugees. So those who weren't matched literally that night could end up waiting a year or more longer than they would have if they fell under a very arbitrary deadline announced with little time. And there's newspaper coverage you can go back and look at in the Globe and Mail about these issues. But to see it up front, this was a major issue. And then the other thing is the caps on refugee sponsorship. So at first, we were working with what are known as sponsorship agreement holders, and they have established relations with the government, and the bureaucratic procedures involved in being a sponsor group under kind of the umbrella of a sponsorship agreement holder is far less onerous than what's required for a group of 5 sponsorship. And so while the caps were lifted, sponsorship agreements could take on a lot more civil society groups and work with them. But once the government reimposed caps limiting the number of sponsors, and each sponsor group would be subject to a cap, we lost that ability to work with sponsorship agreement holders. And then also that groups of 5 faced more restrictive conditions when it comes to UNHCR status certificates. So really abruptly shifting landscapes and long processing times were a major problem in trying to run a sustainable and effective refugee sponsorship program. Like our team still, our sponsor group still did a pretty great job, but these were real problems.
Thank you, John, for these answers. And now we are at the end of our first part. I would like to open the floor for the audience, and we would like to see some engagement if possible. I've seen some questions that were asked to our guest speakers. We will address them towards the end, but I have like some specific questions related to our topic. And I will ask the question, and if anyone wants to jump into and answer, that will be great. So my first question is, to what extent do you believe the federal, provincial, and municipal governments have assisted refugees in their resettlement in Canada? And how much interaction did you have with official authorities, if any? So I will put this question into the chat box that you can have access to it, and please feel free to answer whenever you want. And whoever wants to answer, they're welcome.
Maybe I'll take a little bit of a shot there. So John Shields from Ryerson.
Hi, Dr. Shields.
I am part of the chair of a board of a nonprofit called Access Employment. And so one of the things that we've been very active in is actually working both with governments, but also with some employers in terms of trying to get programs that were sort of geared to refugees. And so one of these is the barista program with Starbucks, and it's for youth, refugee youth. And there's also a parallel one that's, well, before the pandemic hit, but I think it's still going forward with IKEA. And it's specialized programs that are trying to get some first Canadian work experience for newcomer youth. And also one of the interests, obviously, barista training is not meant to be a career, but it's kind of like a first step. It's a job, and it's also a way of practicing English as well, in terms of the interaction with clients and so forth. So I think there's been some innovative programming, and I think one of the advantages of this is that often employers have not been very involved in these, and of course employers are the ones that actually hire refugees, and they need to be sort of engaged more deeply in the programming that government and nonprofit agencies are doing. And also there was some work that was done that also connected with some of the unions in terms of the trades. And so some of the Syrian refugees were engaged in the building trades. And that's proven to be successful. And also language programming has sort of gone alongside of those types of initiatives. So rather than have your typical link program that's in a classroom, it's actually linked to on the job, if you will, which tends to be a lot more effective. So I think there's been some with the Syrians, some interesting innovations around programming. I'm not sure how well or how widely recognized they are, but I think they are sort of interesting and good examples that we can learn from, and that we can sort of pull in some of the private businesses into getting engaged and seeing the kind of talent that actually exists within the immigrant communities. I think some of the other initiatives are really around entrepreneurs. So people starting their own small little businesses, which for the Syrian refugees, many of them, of course, were engaged in those kinds of activities in their home countries. And so they're kind of natural to it. But of course, they need some support to get the Canadian context for how you do this and the various types of supports. So those are the ones I guess I would sort of point to.
Thank you, Professor Shields, for this wonderful contribution.
Can I comment on
yes, that? Yes, please.
Thank you, Professor. That's very much amazing points. And I think when I speak about civil society and civil society engagement, I really do mean employers. Most of those employers that did, get up and kind of put themselves forward was possibly also because they were part of private sponsorship groups. So that's kind of where it all started. And I do agree the language programs shifted when employers started to get engaged, because what happened is they were saying, we're going to give them jobs, let's bring the language to the jobs, right? And that's why I think that civil society engagement with resettlement of refugees and newcomers at large will really change resettlement in Canada, because that's kind of how innovation is going to start. That's how innovation came about. We saw it happen with the Syrian refugees, and more space for it to happen day in and day out with regular economic class immigrants as well, and everything else. Because it was possible there, it's going to be possible at all levels or in all streams, right? So definitely agree to that. And Saad, I'm going to take a shot at your question too. I'm going to say that the government was all levels of government, federal, provincial, municipal, they all tried to pitch in. There was a lot of effort on all sides, but the part that a lot of people miss is how siloed they are. They don't work together. They work separately. There's a huge opportunity there for us to coordinate efforts between governments a little bit more, to optimize, just as Shireen said, to bring it to that optimal level. A little bit more coordination between the levels has to be taken into consideration. And many official authorities, they themselves went out to communities. They themselves went and spoke to refugees. The Syrian refugee project in particular engaged a lot of people, and that in itself was very unique. But again, there's a lot of replication and duplication of effort that needs to be addressed in order for us to be able to make this an optimal experience for refugees and newcomers and civil society as well, right?
Thank you, Rania. Anyone else want to comment on this question? All right, if we don't have anyone, I have another question for the audience as well. So what other resources communities need in order to improve their involvement in the resettlement process? And I will put this question in the chat box that you can have a look at. Do we have anyone who wants to jump in and from their based experience to see what are other resources communities need to improve their involvement in this resettlement process?
While people think a bit about that, I could mention one promising practice that Canada does that's very useful, and that would be the Refugee Sponsorship Training Program. I think community groups really need support, advice, and even training on how to properly conduct refugee sponsorship, especially education around the ethics of refugee sponsorship, about the power imbalances that can exist between sponsored and sponsored refugees, and how to navigate some of those things, as well as just a lot of the bureaucratic requirements of the program. So I think that's a promising practice that the government has and can certainly provide more support to. I know in recent years it has been a positive development that more centers in areas of the country have had access to our STP and its work. And then just in terms of support, again, is to get files through the system more quickly, and then for the quality of resettlement. Some of the needs that exist in the wider society also need to be done to help refugees. So there's a tremendous shortage of affordable housing in Canada, and this is a need that not just refugees face, but many others, and we need all levels of government to be working to meet some of those needs. So there's a couple at least to get us started.
Thank you, John.
I'm gonna add a little bit to what John said here. There used to be a program that was funded. I'm not saying that it needs to be funded again, but I'm just saying that it was a really good project. I think it went away because it's very difficult to measure or to include measurement in it, but it was called the HOST program. And the HOST program was basically a social mentorship program that was available where any newcomer, which with refugees, and I'm sure government-sponsored refugees in particular would really appreciate this, but any newcomer would be matched with a social mentor within their area. So basically being assigned to a friend who would tell them where to go to buy this, where to go to get that, where's this, where, and that HOST program was actually a funded program for years. I believe it was cut, and there's a report on the IRCC website during Harper years, and I think it was basically because they were not able to really measure impact. And here's the part where I'm just going to always say it. Sometimes social impact in particular can't be measured in numbers. It just can't. So sometimes this is one of the things we need to start considering. And I think it's one of the things we saw clearly when we did activities and mapping journeys and mapping services and access Welcome Home TO, is that you can't, sometimes you just can't measure social impact. You can't measure return of investment when there's social impact included. And you just have to believe and do those longitudinal studies and observations on how when you help 10 people, those 10 people will help another 10, and those 10 will help another 20, and that grows, that ripple of social impact grows, and we need to just consider that. So.
Thank you, Rania. So I still have a question for you from a member of the audience. And earlier you talked about raising awareness about like refugees, the programs that are made for refugees, and talking that refugees are still arriving and needing support. How do we continue that awareness?
That's to me, the question?
Yes.
Yeah. That requires a hackathon, but I'm gonna say we're not using technology well enough. We're not. There's so many things that are happening out there. That's where it's great when civil society start getting involved, because there's a lot of tools that we can utilize that can help us better respond faster to the needs of refugees, but we're not utilizing them enough. There's not one place where you can go, and I've seen it with so many private sponsor groups. I myself sponsored 2 families with a work group under the BVOR, and I work in the sector, I work in the employment settlement sector, and I know exactly where every service is, and yet there were certain things that were like, okay, I can't find something to help them with that. So there needs to be, we need to be able to utilize at least technology a bit better and fund those projects that are able to connect us faster or provide accessibility faster for refugees. At Welcome Home TO, one of the hackathons, we imagined a platform that is able to ask you who you are, and then from there, it can tell you where you need to go to and who you need to connect with. But nothing right now in the system kind of first asks you who you are, what you bring, and then connects you accordingly. And with AI technologies and everything, this is very much possible. Why is it not being done, or why is it not materializing? I don't think I still have an answer to that, except that it requires a lot of funding and there's no investment being put forward for it. So
yes.
I hope that.
Yeah, I just want to make a comment on the technology, because I think it's a really good point. And obviously, the pandemic has really put this to the fore. You know, and part of the problem, certainly for settlement agencies, has been that you know, government invests in programs, but they don't really. They have very limited funding in terms of the operations and the infrastructure. And I think some of that has been realized with the pandemic. There is some efforts to put more investments into technology, because technology is critical. You know, the settlement agencies are not going to go, you know, just back to normal after the pandemic. I think there's going to be more online. Obviously, a lot of immigrants, including refugees, who are obviously more vulnerable, use technology a lot already, but we need the investment and we need the training of the staff and so forth for this, and that's a significant commitment. And we've, you know, the funding model has to change to sort of reflect that. I think it's also endemic, and this relates to the question before, Sad, that you raised, is that some of our community-based public spaces are really important. And I'm thinking here especially of libraries. You know, many newcomers, including refugees, use libraries as a major resource. And also to get connected to technology, because not all of them can afford the internet. I go to my local or walk by my local library during the pandemic, and you see a lot of people outside who are, you know, because the library left their connections available during the pandemic, where they're connecting in. But also, you know, the settlement programs also run through libraries, and so maintaining those public institutions, which have, you know, come under threat with budget cuts and may come under greater threats after the pandemic, I think is going to be really critical. We need that kind of infrastructure, social infrastructure. You know, that really is what helps, I think, build resilience. It's not just one organization, but it's the network of organizations and the network of those public bodies, especially the community-based public bodies, that really provide that reinforcing support. And of course, it's uneven, because a place like Toronto has a lot of it, and the 905 area has much less of it. It's a different type of settlement model. So there's uneven geographies here. Some of that can be partly bridged, I think, through technology, but only partly.
Thank you.
Hi.
Yes, hello.
Sorry. Yeah, go.
Oh, no, that's okay. Go ahead, Rania. I'll comment after you.
I just wanted to point out that it's a great point what is mentioned, and we fail to see the systems approach to all of this, because just as Dr. Schultz just said, most refugees, and to what John earlier said, that living, the housing rates and living the accommodation expenses and all has really made a lot of refugees go out into suburban areas, which don't have a lot of transportation access and all this, so they were more isolated into their homes. And while, say, in Halton, for example, I live in Halton, most of the settlement is done through libraries. They can't get to the libraries. They can't go there because they can't drive, and the transportations in suburban areas is not fully, it's not like Toronto, right? And so there's a systems picture here that we need to also consider, and that's where the connection between federal, provincial, and municipal needs to get better, because you need to start looking at this picture at large and be able to connect those dots in terms of, okay, even if I'm going to put them into more affordable houses far away, what's available for them there? And how do I connect them to the bigger picture then?
Great. So if I may, is that okay? So just a quick introduction. My name is Beverly, and I am joining the call today from Fort McMurray, Alberta. I'm the manager of newcomer and immigrant services with the YMCA of Northern Alberta. So for those who may not know, Fort McMurray is a little town north of Edmonton. And of course, Edmonton is the closest town to us, which is, and it's 500 kilometers away. So the sense of isolation is great for just everyday Canadian residents, but even amplified with our newcomer and immigrant populations. And one of the things that we found is really when we're talking about access to technology during COVID, that has probably been one of the greatest needs for our community in terms of connecting newcomers to services that are available to them. Access to technology and digital literacy are really one of the key areas that we're trying to tackle. Since COVID began, we provided settlement services to about 800 clients, and those are the ones that have been fortunate to have access to technology, because everything has been remote since. And just to give you a sense of how, how it impacts people on the ground, just yesterday, we had somebody be referred to our office who has been in Canada since May, has not known about settlement services, and was in need of winter coats for their children and had no idea, nowhere of getting them. And they were just approached by somebody on the street who noticed that they didn't have winter jackets. And today it's minus 37 degrees with a wind chill. So if you can just imagine that, coupled with all the other challenges that being a newcomer to any community entail, it's a quite dire and serious situation for many. So I'm just really struggling, and would love also some input around perhaps funding or any other resources available for us to be able to really assist people and connect them to either laptops and internet services at home. We also work with students, newcomer students, with our school support workers in schools programs where they don't have technology at home, they don't have internet at home, their parents are not able to speak English. Another key issue would be access to translation and interpretation services and resources. So when kids are off school or working from home, these kids aren't able to connect and have no way of seeking out other resources. So yeah, COVID has been a real eye-opener. And one of the key things also is seeing how just the everyday inequities that newcomers face pre-COVID, how those have now been transferred over into this virtual existence is another thing too. But yeah, it's just so much. And I'm sorry, it's kind of like a venting.
Yeah.
It's a little therapy session for me, but it's really hard to see people struggling to the point where it affects them physically and emotionally and mentally and financially, and yeah.
Beverly, thank you so much for sharing. I can't tell you how much this emphasizes that point of geography of race when it comes to resettlement. If we understood refugees' needs, we would know that Fort McMurray would be the last place we would expect them to integrate in, right? So I can only imagine the hardships faced by you and others who are in charge of, helping them resettle. Thank you for all your work. I want to also mention a story of mine. I went to Northwest Territories Yellowknife not too long ago, where I witnessed, it's such a marginalization on top of marginalization. 2 Syrian refugee families in all of Yellowknife, Northwest Territories, are there in the city of Yellowknife trying to resettle of their own, with access to nobody in that hometown that speaks Arabic. So I can only imagine what it's like for maybe Arab newcomers over there in Fort McMurray, who are just already with the cold. They have a big culture shock and a big weather shock, and now they have, everything else, so many shocks on top of one another. So the layers of traumas, even pre-migration and post-migration, is even more emphasized. Thank you. I just wanted to thank you
You're
and share
welcome.
my story and how it relates. I really think that this goes back to the government policy piece, and how more work needs to be done about ensuring where we put refugees when we bring them here, and how important that plays a huge role in their resettlement and integration process, specifically when it comes to their access of social capital. And if they don't have anyone that they can have access to, they would have much more challenges and more barriers and more less room for advocacy.
Right. And also, just to add to that, I have to say, having lived in Fort McMurray for 10 years and having moved from Nova Scotia, that this is a great community. It's a great community, diverse community for newcomers. All in all, especially in the summer, if you do engage with them, you'll find that they're having a pleasant integration and really enjoying calling Fort McMurray home. It's just those other challenges that are amplified due to COVID, due to the cold weather, and just the current even economic situation in our region. So, but yeah, it's a great community for newcomers as well.
Thank you, Beverly and Shireen, for bringing this into the discussion. This is very important to address in sessions like this. And I hope that everyone can get access to the basic needs and to keep safe in these conditions, whether like in the pandemic or in winter situations. I have a question from Faida from the audience to John, and she asks if you could give more information about how refugee students at York helped other refugee students in their social integrations.
Yeah, sure. Maybe just quickly first, yeah, Beverly, the experiences you shared were, yeah, very important, and it pointed to a lot of structural challenges. The just what you were saying even about winter jackets and things is, really sad to hear. It just based on some experience we had at York, I wonder if there might be some civil society organizations just for that one question. Maybe it's worth trying to reach out to some local schools or religious institutions, or even having a media story about a problem like that and saying you're open to donations at your settlement organization. It might, I mean, I know there's so many challenges you're mentioning. I'm just, for that particular one, just having seen some voluntary initiatives be very effective. And we kind of mobilized the York student community, and we had a really impressive collection that we were able to give to FCJ Refugee Center, because yeah, a lot of refugees just arrive without that type of clothing. So that's just maybe.
Right. Thank you, John. Yes, I will definitely look into that, into connecting with other agencies as well in our area. Thank you.
It's just that one doesn't cost people a lot of money, and so many people have things in their closet.
Yes.
I would just mention to be very specific in what you need if you were to go that route, because some people take this as their chance to sadly empty their closet of garbage. Whereas, so if you want winter clothing specific, just be specific. But just for Faida's question about how refugee students at York, and I'm sure this is true elsewhere, help to integrate their refugee students. I mean, this is a key part of the WUSC model, which is university students sponsoring and being leaders of the integration of refugee students who are resettled and brought to Canada. These are students coming to enroll at our universities, and those settlement efforts. So for example, the students, many of the refugee students who come to Canada actually become leaders of their own WUSC committees. So if they're not say the president of the local WUSC chapter, they'll take on prominent roles. And so they meet the refugee students at the airport. They help them figure out how to buy the books. They introduce them to the community. It's really a peer-to-peer model. And it's just in so many instances, these refugees are resettled to Canada, and they make these incredible contributions to our communities, including in supporting the resettlement of other refugees. So I hope that addresses your question, Beta. I can't go on and on about the contributions that these refugee students make, but they really are phenomenal.
Thank you, John. And then to close our session, I would like to ask a final question for everyone. In a reimagination of refugee resettlement in Canada, how can we ensure the voice of refugees is heard? How can we ensure the participation of refugees in the civic and democratic activities in Canada? And I will put this question into the chat box. And please feel free, whoever wants to answer this question. Thank you.
So I just want to clarify, is the last question, how can we ensure the participation of refugees in civic and democratic activities in Canada in relation to voting and participating in the federal democracy here in Canada?
It can be in relation to voting, but it can be in relation also to like the civic life in general, how to ensure that they have a sense of belonging, they feel that they belong to Canada, for example.
Okay, because feeling like you belong in Canada is related to integration than it is to civic life, right? Civic life is often, specifically when you refer to democratic activities, it's related to something completely different. And it's a bit triggering, to be honest, because more like most institutions expect refugees with no background in democracy, particularly the 73,000 Syrian refugees that came in the last 6 years, to understand, to be engaged, to want them to be engaged. I think it's, when we have to keep it, when people are coming, they're trying to survive, they're trying to get food on the table, they're trying to be employed, they're worried about these basic necessities, and they come from a place with no background in democracy, in the sense that it's dangerous to be politically engaged, and it's dangerous to even raise your voice, right? It takes a long time to really want to even be engaged, because for them, they fled they were forced to leave their home countries because of the political trauma here, right? And now we're expecting them to ensure that they understand who to vote for and be kind of like thankful that or grateful for being here, etc. So I think this question would maybe be more suitable for maybe newcomers who have come 20 years ago, 30 years ago, and now we can see how they're doing when it comes to civic participation. But nevertheless, refugees, and particularly the new Syrian refugees, we've seen them kind of contribute in all aspects of civic society, whether it's through, trying to give back through businesses, or refugees hiring other refugees, or refugees supporting one another. We see it, and it speaks to the volume and sense of community that we have as people, no matter where we go, right? But I really wanted to highlight that difference, because it's often studied in the literature without an understanding of culture, without an understanding of those pre-migration challenges, of the historic political kind of views, and these ideologies that people come with and bring to the West, right? So it's really important to make that distinction when we reimagine the future, reimagine a visionary future, which I like to do for all newcomers when we talk about overall integration and civic participation. I personally believe, the key to answering, ensuring that the voices of refugees is heard is to simply ask. It's not that difficult to ask a refugee what they think it needs to be done to better support them and their own families who migrated with them. But I also think, we need to ensure that, again, I wrote this in the chat because it's extremely important, but we need to not, integration will only prevail for newcomers if we spend time not only lauding these inclusion accomplishments like we did today also, but humbly acknowledging those areas of failure and ensuring that we work on those areas of failure for a brighter future.
Thank you so much, Shireen. Anyone wants to make the final comment? We are at the end of our session.
I don't want to say a final comment, but I do want to answer that question.
Yes.
I want to highlight that there's a lot of very positive cases out there that we've seen during the Syrian refugee integration of how some newcomer refugees themselves who used to have active or participating roles with UNHCR on refugee camps or whatnot, when they were moved here, they were given opportunities, maybe very small contracts or small jobs, to be able to work with settlement agencies to help their community. And many of them did great examples. They initiated amazing initiatives like Newcomers Kitchen and the choirs and the things like that, where there is, they were newcomer themselves and they took on programs to help people like them integrate and settle. But because they had some sort of social work background or something of the sort, they were quickly kind of taken in to facilitate, right? That was a great example that we've seen over and over. We've seen many people succeed that way. And just as Shireen said, you want someone to participate, ask them. And these people did that. They just went to refugees and said, what do you need, right? But they were also closer to them because they were able to relate to them. They were able to understand their experience because they themselves were refugees and they themselves had same cultural backgrounds. And so we need to make sure that we understand that perspective. So yeah, that I just wanted to point that out, that was an example, live example that we've seen, and I'm sure you also invited them in your digital series before. We've seen amazing examples of young Syrian youth who were capable with the language themselves, and they went ahead and they started initiatives to help their community resettle and settle, and it made sense and it was successful, and it gave a lot of great examples. The other thing in terms of reimagining the settlement system, there's so many ways we can go, but again, I'll take it back to civil society. There needs to be a little bit more weight shifted to civil society on that, or at least included. They should not be it should not be, this is government, this is this is that. There should be more of a collaborative effort there. And in terms of what Beverly, for example, also said, I truly agree that, we need to encourage more resettlement in various communities, because most of those remote communities many of them are the most welcoming communities out there. But isolation is a whole different situation. So I remember, for example, speaking before to the Secretariat of Refugee Settlement here, Victoria, her name was, and she's also associated with Ryerson, when she said we need to think about models of how, when we come to settle and resettle refugees, if we can do it in communities, right? Like you can take them in batches and then be able to say, be together, and us as a community will help you settle, right? Because isolation is a huge factor that you need to that you need to consider. And my final thing to say is that in order to reimagine a better refugee settlement system, we ourselves need to address the stigma we have against the word refugee. There's still a lot of stigma around that word, and only when we break that down and be able to look at it in a different way, we're going to be able to reimagine a better system for sure.
So can I just add to that, what Rania said and what Shireen said earlier about asking the refugees what they would want. I do have to say that in this conversation, I wear two hats, which is also my refugee hat. I came to Canada many years ago as a refugee, fortunately so. And that's why in my comment, I wrote the right to vote, regardless of what we would presume as one understanding of our democratic system. I think that it's a fundamental right for everybody. Now it's Canadian citizens, but everybody residing in Canada should have the ability to voice themselves, their views politically, and that's why I said that. So thank you, and thank you so much for this. It's been great.
Thank you, Beverly.
You're welcome.
May I add something, please?
Please,
Hello?
Faida, go. Yes, please, Faida, go ahead.
Yeah. I agree with Shireen that most of these refugees we are dealing with now, they came from like not democratic country. So like voting and be involved in the political life, it's a kind of not part of their culture. But I found it in the second generation or in their kids who grow up here, it's totally will be different and they will be involved in everything. And we have many examples, especially now with the Trudeau cabinets, how many refugees we have. Based on my research, it's not just refugee and immigrant, third generation, they don't care about politics. All what they care to find a decent life, food on the table, and raise their kids. Their kids is the one who get involved in everything after that. It doesn't matter the age they came, but based on my study, okay, I found like second generation is the one who getting involved. Also, I want to go back to the sense of belonging. Like we are mistaken, and even in many of our research we are doing when we ask the refugee, like the sense of belonging to Canada, and they will say they belong. But if you keep like digging deep, you feel like they don't know what's the meaning. Because I was doing a kind of questioning and I asked, do you belong to Canada? Some of them, yeah, and Canada is my country. And I said, okay, do you prefer it here or your back home country? No, my back home country. This is my country. So the sense of belonging, it's a very, very, very tricky question.
Yeah.
Very tricky question. Like you will ask many people, me personally, you ask me sometimes, I said, I'm a Canadian citizen. Do I have the sense of belonging even I have been living here for a long time? Or I still have the sense of belonging to my home country? It's not easy to define sense of belonging, but you will find that the sense of belonging is good with the second generation.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Faida. Yes, like there are concepts that are having like a broad like meaning, but it's very important for us to kind of trying to redefine those meanings while we continue our journey in seeking knowledge or helping people who are in need. So I would like to thank everyone, especially our guests, Rania and Shireen and John, for this wonderful session. We have learned a lot from you and from your work. And I want to thank also the audience for their wonderful engagement, whether orally or in the chat box. And finally, I want to thank the members of the Ryerson for Settlement, Immigration and Settlement team, Turney, Suhail, and Dr. Usha for allowing us to organize events like this and foster discussions around issues that matter to people. And I was very happy and pleased to hear from you all. And I would like to let you know that we continue our series in the new year. On January, we will host 2 more sessions, and we will try to tackle the resettlement process of refugees from different angles. So we will keep you informed, and thank you so much for attending this session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Saad, for your leadership. Appreciate you and your work.
Thank you so much. Have a good day, and I wish you happy holidays and happy New Year at the same time. Thank you.
Take care. Happy
Thank you, Saad,
And
for
please stay
inviting me.
safe. Everyone stay safe. Thanks.
You too.
Thank you.
Shukran.
Thanks.